Welcome back. Let's read some of the old. That's some of my olds. I was reading before I was going to read about Israel. So we have to read some of this. But let's try just read from one end.
Pandemic. Early in the COVID-19 pandemic, convention centers, pictured here, were deemed to be ideal sites for temporary hospitals, due to their existing infrastructure, electrical, water, sewage. 1. Hotel song dormitories were also considered appropriate because they can use negative pressure technology. 1. A pandemic, /PNDMK/pandemic, is an epidemic of an infectious disease that has spread across a large region, for instance multiple continents or worldwide, affecting a substantial number of individuals. Widespread endemic diseases with a stable number of infected individuals such as recurrences of seasonal influenza are generally excluded as they occur simultaneously in large regions of the globe rather than being spread worldwide. Throughout human history, there have been a number of pandemics of diseases such as smallpox. The most fatal pandemic in recorded history was the Black Death, also known as the plague, which killed an estimated 75-200 million people in the 14th century. 2, 3, 4, 5. The term had not been used then, but was used for later epidemics, including the 1918 influenza pandemic, more commonly known as the Spanish flu. 6, 7, 8. The most recent pandemics include the HIV/AIDS pandemic, 9, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic. Almost all these diseases still circulate among humans, though the impact now is far less. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, recently 194 member states of the World Health Organization began negotiations on an international treaty on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, with a requirement to submit a draft of this treaty to the 77th World Health Assembly during its 2024 convention. This is expected to set rules for dealing with a pandemic by the international community. 10, 11. Definition. Depiction of the burial of bodies during Black Death, which killed up to half of Eurasia's population in the 14th century. American Red Cross workers carry a body during the 1918-20 Spanish flu pandemic. A medical dictionary definition of pandemic is an epidemic occurring on a scale that crosses international boundaries, usually affecting people on a worldwide scale. 12. A disease or condition is not a pandemic merely because it is widespread or kills many people, it must also be infectious. For instance, cancer is responsible for many deaths but is not considered a pandemic because the disease is not contagious, i.e. easily transmissible, and not even simply infectious. 13. This definition differs from colloquial usage in that it encompasses outbreaks of relatively mild diseases. 14, 15. The World Health Organization's nearest equivalent of pandemic is what is known as a public health emergency of international concern, defined as an extraordinary event which is determined to constitute a public health risk to other states through the international spread of disease and to potentially acquire a coordinated international response. 16. There is a rigorous process underlying this categorization and a clearly defined trajectory of responses. 17. A WHO-sponsored international body, tasked with preparing an international agreement on pandemic prevention, Preparedness and Response has defined a pandemic as the global spread of a pathogen or variant that infects human populations with limited or no immunity through sustained and high transmissibility. From person to person, overwhelming health systems with severe morbidity and high mortality, and causing social and economic disruptions, all of which require effective national and global collaboration and coordination for its control. 18. The word comes from the Greek pan meaning all, or every, and demos people. Parameters. A common early characteristic of a pandemic is a rapid, sometimes exponential, growth in the number of infections, coupled with a widening geographical spread. 19. Who utilizes different criteria to declare a public health emergency of international concern, FIC, its nearest equivalent to the term pandemic. 20. The potential consequences of an incident are considered rather than its current status. 21. For example, polio was declared a FIC in 2014 even though only 482 cases were reported globally in the previous year. Winking sad smiley 22. This was justified by concerns that polio might break out of its endemic areas and again become a significant health threat globally. 23. The FIC status of polio is reviewed regularly and is ongoing, despite the small number of cases annually. B. 24. The end of a pandemic is more difficult to delineate. Generally, past epidemics and pandemics have faded out as the diseases become accepted into people's daily lives and routines, becoming endemic. 25. The transition from pandemic to endemic may be defined based on a high proportion of the global population having immunity through either natural infection or vaccination. Fewer deaths. Health systems step down from emergency status. Perceived personal risk is lessened. Restrictive measures such as travel restrictions removed. Less coverage in public media. 26. 27. An endemic disease is always present in a population, but at a relatively low and predictable level. There may be periodic spikes of infections or seasonality, for example influenza, but generally the burden on health systems is manageable. 26. Prevention and Preparedness. Infographic illustrating the benefits of a treaty for pandemic prevention. Click here for expanded version. Pandemic prevention comprises activities such as anticipatory research and development of therapies and vaccines, as well as monitoring for pathogens and disease outbreaks which may have pandemic potential. 28. Routine vaccination programs are a type of prevention strategy, holding back diseases such as influenza and polio which have caused pandemics in the past, and could do so again if not controlled. 29. Prevention overlaps with preparedness which aims to curtail an outbreak and prevent it getting out of control. It involves strategic planning, data collection and modeling to measure the spread, stockpiling of therapies, vaccines and medical equipment, as well as public health awareness campaigning. 30. By definition, a pandemic involves many countries, so international cooperation, data sharing, and collaboration are essential, as is universal access to tests and therapies. 28. Collaboration. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, WHO established a pandemic hub in September 2021 in Berlin, aiming to address weaknesses around the world in how countries detect, monitor and manage public health threats. The hub's initiatives include using artificial intelligence to analyze more than 35,000 data feeds for indications of emerging health threats, as well as improving facilities and coordination between academic institutions and WHO member countries. 31. Detection. In May 2023, WHO launched the International Pathogen Surveillance Network, IPSN, hosted by the Pandemic Hub, aiming to detect and respond to disease threats before they become epidemics and pandemics, and to optimize routine disease surveillance. The network provides a platform to connect countries, improving systems for collecting and analyzing samples of potentially harmful pathogens. 32. Therapies and vaccines. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, is developing a program to condense new vaccine development timelines to 100 days, a third of the time it took to develop our COVID-19 vaccine. CEPI aims to reduce global epidemic and pandemic risk by developing vaccines against known pathogens as well as enabling rapid response to disease. 33. 34. In the U.S., the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, has developed a pandemic preparedness plan which focuses on identifying viruses of concern and developing diagnostics and therapies, including prototype vaccines, to combat them. 35. 36. Modeling is important to inform policy decisions. It helps to predict the burden of disease on healthcare facilities, the effectiveness of control measures, projected geographical spread, and timing and extent of future pandemic waves. 37. Public awareness involves disseminating reliable information, ensuring consistency on message transparency, and steps to discredit misinformation. 38. Stockpiling involves maintaining strategic stockpiles of emergency supplies such as personal protective equipment, drugs and vaccines, and equipment such as respirators. Many of these items have limited shelf life, so they require stock rotation even though they may be rarely used. 39. Pandemic management strategies. Social distancing in public goals of mitigation include delaying and reducing peak burden on healthcare, flattening the curve, and lessening overall cases and health impact. 40. 41. Also, increasing healthcare capacity, raising the liners by increasing bed count, personnel, and equipment, helps to meet increased demand. 42. 43. Mitigation attempts that are inadequate in strictness or duration, such as premature relaxation of physical distancing rules or stay-at-home orders, can allow our surgeons after the initial surge and mitigation. 44. Without pandemic containment measures such as social distancing, vaccination, and use of face masks, pathogens can spread exponentially. 45. This graphic shows how early adoption of containment measures tends to protect wider swaths of the population. The Red Cross recommended 2-layer gauze masks to contain the Spanish flu, 1918. 46. The basic strategies in the control of an outbreak are containment and mitigation. Containment may be undertaken in the early stages of the outbreak, including contact tracing and isolating infected individuals to stop the disease from spreading to the rest of the population. Other public health interventions on infection control and therapeutic countermeasures such as vaccinations, which may be effective if available. 47. When it becomes apparent that it is no longer possible to contain the spread of the disease, management will then move on to the mitigation stage, in which measures are taken to slow the spread of the disease and mitigate its effects on society and the healthcare system. In reality, containment and mitigation measures may be undertaken simultaneously. 48. A key part of managing an infectious disease outbreak is trying to decrease the epidemic peak, known as flattening the curve. 43. This helps decrease the risk of health services being overwhelmed and provides more time for a vaccine and treatment to be developed. 43. A broad group of non-pharmaceutical interventions may be taken to manage the outbreak. 43. In a flu pandemic, these actions may include personal preventive measures such as hand hygiene, wearing face masks, and self-quarantine. Community measures aimed at social distancing such as closing schools and cancelling mass gatherings. Community engagement to encourage acceptance and participation in such interventions, and environmental measures such as cleaning of surfaces. 41. Another strategy, suppression, requires more extreme long-term non-pharmaceutical interventions to reverse the pandemic by reducing the basic reproduction number to less than 1. The suppression strategy, which includes stringent population-wide social distancing, home isolation of cases, and household quarantine, was undertaken by China during the COVID-19 pandemic, where entire cities were placed under lockdown. Such a strategy may carry with it considerable social and economic costs. 49. Frameworks for influenza pandemics. WHO system. For a novel influenza virus, WHO previously applied a 6-stage classification to delineate the process by which the virus moves from the first few infections in humans through to a pandemic. Starting with Phase 1, infections identified in animals only, it moves through phases of increasing infection and spread to Phase 6, pandemic. 50. In February 2020, a WHO spokesperson clarified that the system is no longer in use. 51. CDC frameworks. Influenza intervals in the CDC's Pandemic Intervals Framework. In 2014, the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, introduced a framework for characterizing the progress of an influenza pandemic titled the Pandemic Intervals Framework. 52. The 6 intervals of the framework are as follows: investigation of cases of novel influenza, recognition of increased potential for ongoing transmission, initiation of a pandemic wave, acceleration of a pandemic wave, deceleration of a pandemic wave, and preparation for future pandemic waves. At the same time, the CDC adopted the Pandemic Severity Assessment Framework, SIF, to assess the severity of influenza pandemics. 52. The SIF rates the severity of an influenza outbreak on 2 dimensions: clinical severity of illness in infected persons, and the transmissibility of the infection in the population. 53. This tool was not applied during the COVID-19 pandemic. 54. Notable pandemics and outbreaks. Recent outbreaks. COVID-19. SARS-CoV-2, a new strain of coronavirus, was first detected in the city of Wuhan, Hubei Province, China in December 2019. 56. The outbreak was characterized as a public health emergency of international concern, FIC, between January 2020 and May 2023 by WHO. 57. 58. The number of people infected. Total confirmed cases of COVID-19 per million people, 55, with COVID-19 has reached more than 767 million worldwide, with a death toll of 6.9 million. C. 59. It is considered likely that the virus will eventually become endemic and, like the common cold, cause less severe disease for most people. 60. HIV/AIDS. A world map illustrating the proportion of population infected with HIV in 2019. HIV/AIDS was first identified as a disease in 1981, and is an ongoing worldwide public health issue. 61. 62. Since then HIV/AIDS has killed an estimated 40 million people, with a further 630,000 deaths annually. 39 million people are currently living with HIV infection. D. 61. HIV has a zoonotic origin, having originated in non-human primates in Central Africa and transferred to humans in the early 20th century. 63. The most frequent mode of transmission of HIV is through sexual contact with an infected person. There may be a short period of mild, non-specific symptoms followed by an asymptomatic, but nevertheless infectious, stage called clinical latency. Without treatment, this stage can last between 3 and 20 years. The only way to detect infection is by means of a HIV test. 64. There is no vaccine to prevent HIV infection, but the disease can be held in check by means of antiretroviral therapy. 65. Pandemics in history.